Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode here of Bulletproof Selling. My name is Sean Rhodes, and I'm the Chief Sales Sergeant of Bulletproof Selling. And here, our motto, our creed, our why is that we believe that hope is not a sales strategy. And yet, so many salespeople are having to rely on it or they're forced to rely on it. Well, here, we exist to increase the performance of salespeople and the results of their teams by giving them something a little more powerful than hope. Now, this series that we have here, we get to interview the top minds in sales, speakers, trainers, authors, consultants, and those that have been out there in the field managing their own sales teams. And my commitment is that out of every one of these shows, we're going to help you remove some of that hope that you might have been using in your sales process with certainty, with a system, a very specific system that we get to build with our guests. And I'm very excited to be inviting the guest that we're going to have on today because David and I have gotten to chat a couple of times. I've been on his show. He thinks very systemically about the field of sales. So we're going to have a lot of fun together. It's my pleasure to welcome on Mr. David Masover. David, welcome to Bulletproof Selling, sir.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, David, for those of us that haven't read the bio on you, they maybe didn't catch my interview on your show where you were kind enough to invite me on. Talk to us a little bit about your background in sales, how you ended up helping sales teams, and a little bit about kind of the journey that you've been on to get here.
Sure. Happy to. When people ask me this question, I always start at the beginning and tell people I got my first sales job in 1991. But don't worry, I'm not going to take you through year by year, but it's actually kind of relevant. Yeah. So, and then the next day, right? Well, I did. I got my first sales job in 1991, and it was for a company that sold consumable computer supplies. So discs and ribbons and toner cartridges, pure commodity stuff. Gotcha. My training was 2 days sitting with the boss, basically deconstructing product to see how it worked, which was interesting, I guess, but it didn't do anything to train me to sell. Right. And then it was like, here's your desk, here's your phone, here's the list of the person who just quit. Give your orders to Mary over there when you're done. Good luck. That was it.
That's your entire training right there. That's it, right?
That was it. And I remember that moment so clearly. Because every job I had ever had until then, I was a very good employee. I did well. I succeeded. I worked hard. My peers and my bosses, they were like, wow, David, you're really on the ball. This is great. And here I am looking around this room, listening to my new colleagues having these very jovial conversations, laughing and joking and then writing up orders. And I'm sitting there looking at my phone going, I have no idea how to do that. I don't know what to do. Luckily, well, I don't know if luck's the right word. I'm happy with where I am, so we're going to call it luck. But luckily, I'm stubborn. So I decided I'm not going to let this sales thing beat me. And I decided to hang in and figure it out. And as I tell the story today, basically, I created the sales process. I learned later that someone else had already done so and much more thoroughly than I had. But this is how I mentally approached it. I didn't know what sales was. But I could break it down into the little pieces. Who should I be talking to? And why would they want to talk to me? And what should I say to them when we get into a conversation? And once we're a little bit into the conversation and there's actually going to be one, what kind of stuff should we be talking about? So in this way, I was able to think about what I'm supposed to do. And then I discovered audio books, Brian Tracy's Psychology of Selling, Tom Hopkins' book. And over time, I became very good at selling, which of course means they promote you into sales management. And the same story repeated itself, right? I had no idea what to do as a sales manager. Here's your team. Here's your new business card. Good luck. And the same approach was very effective. Let's break it down into the little pieces. So I think that my approach to sales being this kind of methodical process orientation, it really comes from trial by fire, being thrown into the pool to see if I could sink or swim. And that was the life preserver that helped me out. And here I am 30 years later as an author and as a consultant, and I use basically the same core concept. I've learned a lot along the way. I've learned how to effectively communicate this better than I did 30 years ago and 20 years ago and 10 years ago. But it's the same basic idea. Let's just stop, slow down, ask the basic core questions and answer them really thoroughly, and then tie our answers together so that we wind up with a systematic, disciplined, coordinated approach to sales and selling. So that's, I don't know if that's short or not, but that's kind of the where I started, how I got here today, and how I think about sales in 2 minutes or less.
That's wonderful. And you brought up a couple of great points from both ends of the sales career spectrum. So you talked about when you first got into sales, they gave you 2 days of maybe shadowing someone if you're lucky, saying, here's the thing that you're selling, here's who you hand your orders off to. If you're really lucky, you might get a list of leads instead of having to go out there and find them on your own. Then it's just like smile and dial. And I see so many salespeople that are new to the business or new to a new industry, they're dropped in exactly that same situation. And so it is sink or swim. And then you took us all the way to the other side of things, which was, hey, for those of us that have been in sales for a while, this is something that I was speaking on another podcast last week where they said, Sean, why don't senior salespeople have systems if these systems are so important, if this process that David's talking about is so important? And I'm finding that if I sit one of those salespeople down, they can very clearly map out their entire process. They might not have ever shared it with anybody. They might not have ever committed it to paper, but through 10,000 repetitions, it's definitely in their minds. So if you share with us a little bit about the beginning of your journey, what do you find the senior salespeople are doing in the world right now that really calls for more process or more getting it out of their head so that that junior salesperson has a higher chance of success?
Well, I think you nailed it exactly. When I look at successful salespeople, they all have a process, just like everybody has a social media presence, whether you've worked on it or not, you know? So I think a lot of senior salespeople, they are successful salespeople. They are pretty disciplined about what they do and how they do it. But if you just ask them, so what's your sales process? They'll look at you like a deer in the headlights because they don't think about it that way. It's just, this is what I've done.
Yeah.
And I, this is sales. This is how you do it. Unfortunately, what that means is, and I think this is true of most people in sales. I think most salespeople simply aren't wired to think about what they do beyond what I do when I'm in front of somebody. And the process kind of grows organically in their mind. But that means they can't share it with other people, and they can't.
My next question to you is, well, if we never commit this thing outside of our heads, what is the value in having a process at all? And so you mentioned one, you can never share it, which means
I think there's huge value there's huge value in having the process because the individual can execute. It's just the value doesn't go.
That's the second piece of it. That if I never map it out, I never see all the pieces at once. And I've done this myself, David, and I'm sure you have throughout your sales career, where I do the same thing consistently across all my prospects. And only when I take the time to really map this thing out on a sheet of paper, I realize, well, steps 2 and 4 are redundant. Why do I keep doing it that way? So if I never get the process outside of my head, I can never pass it on. But also, I may be making it more difficult for myself than I need to, huh?
It's difficult to optimize something if you can't really see it. And what I find is, for me personally, not just seeing it on paper, just the process of trying to commit it to paper really makes you think about it in a way that's different, or paper, or, PowerPoint, or, wherever you do it. The medium doesn't matter, but just trying to think about it and articulate it and map it out however you do, it changes the way you think about it. Because instead of being like, to use a sports analogy, like that natural athlete who just catches the ball or makes the basket or hits the ball, or, whatever it is that they do without really thinking about it. Now we've really broken it down. And if you start hitting a slump, or if you get a management position and you need to teach somebody, now you more deeply understand what it is that made you successful, where it is that you might be struggling, where it is that you might optimize. So this process building, systems development exercise has huge value in any number of ways.
And now we're in a sales cycle, because you get to deal with sales teams like I do, walking them through standing up a process that's brand new, or coming into a very established sales team and helping them optimize what they already have committed to paper or gotten into a CRM. Where do you see hope play probably more of a role than it should in those teams that might have a process in place already?
Yeah, I think that's actually really obvious. And you use the word hope a lot. I don't really think about it in those terms, but I think about it in a similar term. I like it. I just don't, that's not my language, but I love it. I think the place where most salespeople struggle is they hope whatever it is that they're selling is going to convince the buyer to buy it. So they'll talk about
Okay.
features, they'll talk about benefits, they'll talk about product, they'll talk about the logos they've acquired. Some will talk about recognition they've received or money that they've raised from very prestigious investors. And prospects don't care.
Yeah.
Prospects don't care. You can hope they care.
Yeah.
You care, and that's great. But the prospect is generally concerned with, how's this thing going to help me? And
Hmm.
if the elements of how your solution can help prospects solve problems isn't baked into your systems and processes, you're just not focused in the right place, at least not the place that your prospects are going to care about.
And so some sales teams, I've seen this where they do sit down and try to map out their processes. Maybe they've read one of your books, they're following David, they've read Bulletproof Selling, they're following Sean, and they say, great, we need some processes. So they sit down and map it out, but they make a critical strategic error in the beginning in that they make it very product focused or them focused rather than customer focused. And so, how do I begin to think about then if I'm going to sit down and start mapping out new sales processes, or I'm looking at my existing ones and saying, well, I absolutely agree with you guys. It is all about us. It shouldn't be. We recognize that's costing us sales. How do we begin to turn this battleship, which has to be done in small degrees? Otherwise, we're
Mm-hmm.
going to have to just set it all on fire and start from scratch, which is probably not the most efficient way to do it. So, how do I begin to take my processes and make them more client centric and move them away from just always talking about me and my logos and my testimonials?
It's a great question. It may be the question. And what I've seen is that when a lot of companies or a lot of salespeople try to solve some kind of a sales problem, or they try to, if you want to spin it in a positive way, they try to create some kind of sales effectiveness opportunity or
Yeah, there you
improvement.
go.
Um, they try to look at one thing. How can I get my messaging better? How can I get my process better? How can I integrate with my tools better? How can I get better leads? I think it has to be a little more holistic than that. When I work with a sales team, I try to take this in a couple of different steps. The first thing I want to do is kind of an archaeology based, or is it anthropology? I always get those two confused. But but either which way, I want to find out what they're doing now. Like, let's talk about what you're doing now and let's map that out. And there's not really a lot of content or context in there. It's just, what are the steps that we're taking? Once that's mapped out, then we have to completely shift gears and talk about the importance of client-focused messaging.
Mm,
Then we can revisit the process and say, okay, where's the disconnect? And by taking people through a process like this, I think they can all of a sudden see, yeah, I work with a model that I call the 4-level sales process. The first level is kind of that stuff that you see in your CRM. This is a lead. This is a prospect. This is a whatever you call the next step. The second level is those tasks. I reach out. I make sure they fit our ICP profile, et cetera, et cetera. The third layer is, how do we do each of those second layer steps? And that's where the client focused perspective or the prospect focused perspective or the problem solution orientation really manifests itself. So I've had the most success by making sure that we try to get our arms around all of that instead of just focusing on one piece at a time. Sales, listen, it's holistic. The pieces work together. And if you're really only focusing on, I want to fix this one thing, you might need to look at the things that are surrounding it to really get the most impact out of whatever it is you're trying to improve. At least that's been my experience.
And so if we do run across a problem then where we notice we're not making number or we're not qualifying prospects or the quality of our prospects is such that we could try to qualify them all day, but nobody's passing the initial filter because nobody's a decision maker. No one's at that level in the organization. How do I begin to take that more holistic look then and ask myself, yes, I'm experiencing this singular problem, but it's got a chain of effects that have led up to it. How do I begin to deconstruct a given sales problem to really stretch back to the source of the issue, which might be the way I'm qualifying leads or the way that I'm trying to negotiate for my meetings or whatever that might look like? How do I take a couple steps back and find the source of a sales problem?
Yeah, another fantastic question. And I think the way you asked the question really illustrates the way that I've approached it with my clients. Maybe there's another way to do it. I haven't had a lot of success in when a client comes to me and says, I've got this one metric or this one issue or this one thing that isn't working.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how to fix that. until we really kind of, I don't, because you don't have context for it. I'm not converting enough leads. What can I do? I'm not a tips and tricks guy. I don't believe that there's a magic 3-step process or a templated script, derived from analyzing prospects in an MRI machine where their dopamine lights up when we say these magic words. I just,
Right.
maybe that stuff works. It doesn't work for me. I like to take a step back, and much like I did in that very first job, just let's ask these questions. Who is it that we're talking to? That might be the problem. What is it that we should be saying to them? Maybe that's the problem. But I don't think we can look at any one point in a process and understand why it isn't working unless we at least have a sense of how that process is constructed to give us some context for answering the question.
And are the other steps of the process doing what they should be doing? I mean, maybe there's a broken link in the chain 4 steps back, and we're really seeing a lot of broken things on the way to leads not converting. So I think this would be a great sales system to help build for salespeople and their leaders, because I think that, like you said, I know I've got a lot of problems, but solving this one thing today may get me a short-term yield, but I'm going to keep seeing the thing recur because there is a broken piece somewhere further back in the sales chain. So you're very familiar with the way that we do things, because I know I've gotten a copy of Bulletproof Selling in your hands, David, where we talk about trimming hope away from a sales strategy. We use the acronym TRIM, TRIM. And the T in this, because the system we're building right now is, hey, how do I really systemize the way that I solve sales problems in a way that allows me to actually find the root cause of any given problem, rather than let's just, fix conversion. But really, my folks down on the customer service side are going to suffer because these folks are not qualified buyers. They don't know how to use it. They're not qualified for budget. I don't want to, create more bad problems. And there's a great Lean Six Sigma kind of a saying that, well, if we optimize a broken situation, we're just going to get more broken stuff. And that's what we're trying to avoid. So in the T in this, the trigger event, how do I really take a step back and know, hey, this is a problem that probably has a root cause that I'm not seeing immediately? How do I really recognize that so I can bring this system into play where I start looking for root causes of my sales issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think the core question just has to be, how did we get here?
Okay.
How did we get here? If it's a conversion problem, when I develop a sales process, I think about it as you have to develop each piece, and then you have to figure out how to tie each piece together. And then you have to figure out how the early stuff is going to help the later stuff work better. And I think until you're really looking at it from this interconnected perspective, you're just not going to get there. I'm not sure if this addresses your question directly, but I just don't know how to do it. I just don't. I just don't think you can say, how can I fix this thing at the end of my process without really looking at what led up to it?
And do I even have a process that we're following? And that is so.
Yes. Okay. That's question number one, right?
Yeah. Am I following a process? So that's question number one to look at in your trigger. Or is this thing happening because everybody's playing jazz across my sales team, and they're all coming to the same problem, which is conversion of leads or can't book meetings or whatever it looks like. But nobody's following a process. So maybe the first thing to do is let's systemize at least one best practice in here, let everybody use it, and then we'll know, should we be building on that? Should we scrap that entirely because even that's not working? Maybe our entire thing needs to be ripped down to the foundations and built back up. So I love the idea of just taking a look at, hey, are we following a process? Let's make the assumption that we are, though. That we have a pipeline established. We've got these cadenced campaigns. We are conducting outreach. We think we're putting our leads through a qualification process. And we even have a couple of discovery questions that our salespeople are required to ask, which I know, and you'd agree with me, if a sales team is doing those things, they're probably whooping the pants of their competition, because very few teams are even approaching it that way. But let's say that's the case, right? Let's step into a best case scenario. I've got this problem, David. All right, so now how do I begin to deconstruct the process in order to make this thing repeatable, which is the R in TRIM? What are the 3 or 4 or 5 steps you recommend any team walk through to find a root cause of an issue?
It's funny when a team tells me that they have a process, usually I see one of two things. Either they've got, when I describe my 4-level sales process, they've got level 1, which is kind of the Kanban board in the CRM. Oh, sure, someone's a lead, and then they're a prospect, and then it's an opportunity, and then we negotiate, and then we close, and and that's fine. But when you dig into it, you find out that everybody on the sales team has a different idea about when do I move somebody from lead to prospect and what has to
Yeah.
happen before I do. So there isn't really any kind of agreement about what these
Mm-hmm.
terms mean. And if there's no agreement about what these terms mean, then you don't really have a process. You have this set of labels that everyone thinks means different things. And until you get some clarity and agreement around that, it's really difficult to have an intelligent conversation, or at least a productive conversation around it. The other thing
Mm-hmm.
that sometimes happens when teams tell me they have a sales process is somebody will dig deep into their drawer or into some file on their computer, and they'll show me this very complicated workflow. And it's like, this is our process. I finally
Yeah.
found it. I haven't looked at this
Yeah.
in 6 months. And that's the
Right.
problem. Just because you wrote it down doesn't mean that it's a process that's actually functioning. So what is a process? I think, Vince Lombardi, gentlemen, this is a football. What is a process? This anthropology or archaeology or, ideology, I don't know what it is, but when you sit your team down in a room and you simply attempt to get buy-in around what do these labels mean and what do we
Mm.
have to do under leads before we turn someone into a prospect, and what has to happen, or what do we need to learn, or what do we need to know before someone is considered qualified and worthy of a demo or a discovery call, or what
Mm-hmm.
do we need to learn in discovery before we write a proposal, or whatever it is that someone does. Simply having everybody in a room to hash that out is very instructive,
Oh yeah.
because everyone is doing something. And if you can simply get everyone in the room to contribute until everyone is nodding and saying, yeah, that model that you put up there looks pretty much like what I do. Now you've got a
Mm-hmm.
point of departure you can work with.
And if that model ceases to work or we want to optimize its results, now we've got a model to operate from rather than, singular issue, which you may have a singular issue in a salesperson that just needs to be coached. But if it's a systemic issue across your team, might be because you don't have a system or your system has never been mapped out. So in the repeatable piece, I'm going to try to synthesize what I heard. One, we need to figure out, do we have a process? Are we following it? Second, we
Mm-hmm.
have to come to a clarity on the definition of what the problem is. And that might
Yep.
require getting the team in the room to be able to define, well, we're having a lead conversion issue. Oh, how do we define a lead? How do we define conversion? How do we define what becomes a lead after it's a lead? Is it a prospect? Is it a customer? Is it an RFP? Like, what are all these terms that we use? And once we've gotten clarity on the definition of what the problem is, what do you find the next step is? And my guess it's close to the last one of being able to get to the root of an issue. So am I using a process? What are my definitions? And let's get clarity on those. And now what is the piece? Let's assume all that has happened. What is the piece that's the next step in this to make it repeatable for finding the root cause of an issue? Is it really, does it become self-apparent? Is it one person in the room raising their hand and saying, oh, I encountered this at some point in my career and here's what we did about it? How do you find that the solution really comes about in this case?
A lot, self-apparent is a really great phrase for what I've seen happen, because
Mm,
as you implied, this idea of sitting down and having a team, everybody on the team, not just the managers, everybody on the team ought to sit down and map out this process. It's very instructive, and it
mm,
also achieves buy-in. And once you have this down for everyone to see and everyone agrees on it, you're not done. You're kind of at the starting line. But
yeah.
the starting line that you have arrived to is one around which you can have a more productive conversation. So
Mm,
instead of saying the leads suck or our conversions aren't where they're supposed to be, now you can actually look at this map and say, we're having a problem here. What was happening prior to that that we
mm,
might change? And is it in the step just prior to that, or maybe 2 steps before that? Or are we targeting the wrong people? Or do we have the wrong messaging? Or is
mm,
our cadence out of whack? It could be any number of things. But until you've got a way of systematically and holistically looking at it,
mm.
everyone's just kind of throwing out their opinions in a very random fashion. And, gosh, I mean, some of that stuff might work, but it's
Yeah.
not a
Yeah.
very systematic or holistic approach to solving the problem. And you're probably going to miss something along the way.
And the problem will likely come back around. Great saying is that if you think of like old analog watches, even a broken one is right twice a day. where
Yeah,
you
not
might
true in the digital age, right?
not true in the digital age. It's very true. Apple Watch, not so much. It's either working or it's not, or it's syncing or it's not. But
That's a
yeah,
different
even a
story.
broken watch. Yeah. So I love the idea that we've gotten this repeatable system down that we can use over and over and over again when we have a sales issue to assess: are we using a system? Are people abiding by it? Which is important. Just because we have a system doesn't mean people are using it. Do we agree on our terms? And once we've got that flow, how do we just work a step backwards and ask, is this the problem? Maybe it isn't. A step before that, is that the problem? Maybe it isn't. Maybe it's 3 or 4 or 5 to 6 steps before the actual situation you find yourself in that we need improvement. And once that's fixed, there's a trickle down to give us the solution we're looking for today. So we've got that repeatable bit in place. But now let's say a team has got this map, this way to improve sales processes and problems. How do I improve it? How do I make it better? Which is the I in this TRIM acronym. How do I
Yep.
get consistently better at finding the root cause of an issue across all of my sales processes?
I hate these what's your favorite questions. What's your favorite
Yeah.
color? What's your favorite ice cream? But I'm going to break my own rule and tell you that I've actually got a favorite metric in sales
Ah.
management. And this metric is the conversion ratio between different stages in a pipeline. But it doesn't work unless you've done that groundwork. It doesn't work unless the stages are clearly defined. But
And I'm
if,
gonna jump ahead a step as well
please,
and say that the M in TRIM is how do we measure it, and that's where
yeah,
metrics come in. So before we
yeah,
really hop too far down there, because I'm interested to get your metric for success here, how do I make sure that I'm improving my sales processes week over week, month over month? So
yeah.
ideally, it's not just an exercise. This exercise of bringing the team together, not just something that we do when there's an issue, but something
hmm
that we do to make sure that we are getting better, that we are adapting to a changing environment. If we have to begin selling completely virtually again, as opposed to hybrid or in person, how do we make sure that our systems and processes are kept up to date with the market around us?
Yeah, but you know what? The improvement and the metrics really ought to work together. Otherwise, why are
Oh,
you
of course they
tracking
do.
the
Yeah, yeah.
metrics?
Okay.
So if you're looking at, if you've got a well-established sales process, it's clearly defined, everyone agrees what it is, your tools are synced up so you can actually measure these things.
Hmm.
Now all of a sudden I've got a baseline. Conversion ratio between stage A and stage B and stage C, stage A and stage X, how much
Right.
time it takes. You start looking at those metrics and you establish a baseline. Now we can ask ourselves, okay, how can I improve the conversion between these two steps? How can I
Mm,
improve the conversion between this, that, and the other? And you want to ask those questions in the context of what have I mapped out? And now you've also got a way to keep score to find out if it's working or not. I'm not sure if that answers your question directly, but I see those two things working very closely together. I know that I
yeah.
want to improve it, but I can't improve it until I know what it is
Hmm.
and I know what my kind of starting score is so that I can tell if my improvement effort actually made a difference or not. And if
Yeah.
you are improving conversion ratios between stages in your process by a
Hmm.
couple of points here and there over time,
Oh,
think
it's
about the
massive.
compound
Yeah.
effect. Think about the compound effect. That's really where I think you have
Yep.
the opportunity to improve with a process and the metrics to measure how you're doing on that effort.
And this is one of those situations where you can definitely notice a problem and map out a process, clarify definitions, get people to solve it wherever it exists, however far back in the process. That's definitely one way to get better. You do that enough, though, you solve the big problems. And I speak on this all the time at conferences, David, and I know it's something you're familiar with as well. It's taking the time to make sure this happens even when we are hitting number, even when our conversions are doing well. It's to say, all right, we're doing okay, but how do we make it even better? And I know you just touched on that. Whereas, all right, we're noticing great conversions. I mean, corporate's very happy, leadership team is great. We're all going on the big cruise to celebrate whenever they open cruises back up. So how do we make it even better? Because we don't just want to get comfortable where we're at the top of our industry, because I guarantee you there's somebody hungrier underneath you willing to work longer and walk through this process as well to improve their sales processes and define them. So it's taking the time to make sure we continue to do it even when things are going great. So I really appreciate you helping us build this entire system out, David. Now, folks that don't know about you, don't know about your work, you're on LinkedIn, you've got a couple of books out there. How do we get deeper into your world, man? Because if people love sales systems and if you like bulletproof selling, I mean, David complements it beautifully. Takes a different tack at it, different look, but that's why you and I get along so well. We could just talk systems for hours. How do we get deeper into your world, man?
I appreciate that. I had a podcast guest on, and he gave a really good answer to that question that I'm just going to copy, which is I
Okay.
Google very well. David Masover, Masover. It took me a while, but on most browsers, I kind of dominate that first page. But that'll get you to my LinkedIn, where I post almost every day. It'll get you to my books on Amazon. I've written a couple on process. One of them is a free Kindle book called Salesman's Guide to Dating, which is actually a process book. It's a fun one. You can get it for free. And you can find my website as well, davidmassover.com. And if you want to talk shop about this kind of stuff, I'd be happy to connect with you.
Love it, man. Well, make sure that you are following David on LinkedIn. Everything that he's posting about, if you like the feel and the flow of what we do here at Bulletproof Selling, you're really going to get a lot out of David's work as well. Make sure that you're following us, of course, on LinkedIn, YouTube, where all these live streams are housed. You can watch them in perpetuity. And, of course, the podcast, iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, anywhere the podcast can be found. For more sales systems just like the one that we built with David to help you replace some of that hope with certainty, make sure you're checking out the resources over at bulletproof-selling.com, where every day of the week we're posting great new content. Well, Sean Rhodes here. It's been a pleasure serving the sales community alongside you, David. Let's get out there and make selling bulletproof.